When they told him to obey, the studio gates rose slowly that morning, iron bars sliding upward with the kind of heavy reluctance that always made Clint Eastwood think of old prisons in black and white. He sat in his car longer than he needed to, hands resting on the steering wheel, engine idling, watching sunlight fracture across the polished concrete lot of Warner's back entrance. The place had once felt like a kingdom to him, a machine of ambition and possibility, humming with scripts and spotlights, and the promise that if you worked hard enough, something meaningful could be built. But that morning, it felt like something else. Something narrower, something colder. A factory. And factories didn't care who dreamed inside them. They only cared who followed instructions. He had been called in early. No script in hand. No casting sheet. Just a summons. The kind that arrived without warmth, without context, and without the courtesy of explanation. Executive meeting, mandatory. That was all. No names, no purpose. No curiosity about whether the man being summoned had slept or eaten, or was carrying something heavier than a briefcase into that room. Clint shut off the engine, opened the door, and stepped into the morning. Inside the studio building, everything smelled faintly of coffee and paper and disinfectant. Assistants moved briskly past him with clipboards, eyes already elsewhere. He nodded to people who had once known his name with excitement and now seemed to carry it like an obligation. The walls were lined with framed posters, old victories preserved like fossils. A reminder that art, once profitable enough, eventually became decoration. The meeting room waited at the end of a long hallway. Double doors closed, opaque glass swallowing whatever happened inside. Clint paused before entering, not out of nerves, out of instinct, the kind that came when a man could feel a line being approached, even before it was crossed. Inside, the room was colder than necessary. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The table was long, polished, reflective, designed less for conversation than for authority. 5 men sat on one side, suits, notepads, coffee cups untouched. All of them looking toward the empty chair across from them. Clint took it. There were pleasantries at first, the kind that never fooled anyone. Compliments about his last performance. Observations about his reliability. Statements about the direction the studio is moving. Phrases stacked on phrases, none of them carrying weight yet. Then finally, the real sentence arrived. "You're not here to shape projects," one of them said, voice smooth, carefully emotionless. "You're here to execute them." Another leaned forward slightly. "Actors don't direct. They obey. That's how this system works. That's how it stays stable." Clint didn't speak at first. He looked at the grain in the table, the faint scratches left by years of pens and rings and nervous hands. He listened to them outline his next roles, his next contracts, his next public image. He listened to them reduce his instincts into risks, his curiosity into inefficiency, his questions into inconvenience. And something inside him went very still. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was something quieter, something older. The recognition of a cage. "You can keep working," another executive said, finally meeting his eyes. "Very successfully. As long as you stay in your lane." Clint breathed in slowly. He thought of the sets he'd been on, where directors whispered instead of spoke. He thought of scripts trimmed until they fit marketing sheets instead of human experience. He thought of scenes where something real had tried to emerge, only to be smoothed away because it made someone uncomfortable in a boardroom. He pushed his chair back. The sound was small, but it cut through the room like a crack in glass. "I didn't come into this to be operated," he said. There was a flicker of surprise, not outrage, not concern. Surprise as if a piece of equipment had made a noise it wasn't designed to make. "You came into this to work," someone replied. Clint stood. "I came into this to build," he said. "And I don't build in rooms where curiosity is treated like a liability." No one raised their voice. No one threatened him. They didn't have to. The system didn't roar. It simply closed doors. "Think carefully," one of them said. "Walking away from this table isn't a statement. It's a disappearance." Clint looked at them. Really looked at the men who controlled projects he would never see, at the decisions that shaped stories before actors ever touched them, at the quiet certainty that power never needed to explain itself. Then he walked. The hallway felt longer on the way out. Each step echoed more than the last. Not because the building had changed, but because he had. Every few feet someone glanced at him. No one stopped him. The gatekeeper rarely confronted those who removed themselves. Outside, the sunlight hit his face harder than expected. He stood there for a moment, unsure where to go. Not physically, but professionally. Spiritually. A man didn't leave a system like that with a plan. He left it with a question. Now, what do you build when no one is funding the blueprint? He drove without direction for a long time, past neighborhoods where extras waited for callbacks, past cafes where scripts were written on napkins and never finished, past studios that had once been symbols and now felt like fortresses. The city moved around him, loud and busy and uninterested in his internal fracture. Eventually, pulled off the road near a small restaurant he barely remembered noticing before. Not famous. Not new. The kind of place that existed because it always had. Sun-bleached sign. Narrow windows. A single neon light. Buzzing faintly, even though it was morning, he went inside. The smell of garlic and coffee and something simmering greeted him. A few tables were occupied by older men who looked like they'd been sitting there for years. The counter gleamed in that careful way that came from habit rather than inspection, and behind it stood Dean Martin, not the star, not the icon, not the voice on records or the smile on posters. Just a man in a pressed shirt, sleeves rolled slightly, drying a glass with slow, deliberate movements. There was no stage light here, no spotlight. Just the hum of a refrigerator and the faint crackle of a radio playing something soft from decades. Go. Dean looked up and smiled, not the practiced grin of performance, but the small, genuine one people wore when they were present. Morning, he said. Clint took a seat at the counter. He didn't know why. He only knew he wasn't ready to go anywhere else. Coffee? Dean asked. Yeah, Clint replied. That'd be good, Dean poured it himself. Didn't rush. Didn't ask who he was. Didn't perform recognition. He simply placed the cup down and nodded once, as if to say, here, something warm, something solid. For a while, neither of them spoke. The restaurant filled slowly. The radio changed songs. Plates clinked. Life continued at a scale that didn't care about contracts or executives or studio gates. Finally, Dean spoke without turning around. You look like someone who just stepped out of a room that didn't want him to be human. Clint almost laughed. Almost. Something like that, he said. Dean leaned on the counter, arms folded loosely. They tell you who to be? They told me who not to be, Clint replied. Dean nodded once. Those are the meetings that linger. Clint took a sip of his coffee. It tasted better than it should have. They said actors don't direct, that they obey. Dean exhaled through his nose softly, not amused, not angry, just familiar. Yeah, he said. They've been saying that to musicians for years. To writers. To anyone who scares the structure by wanting to understand it. He finally turned and looked at Clint properly. There was no judgment there. No curiosity either. Only recognition, Dean continued. The first time I tried to change anything on a set, a man who never learned my name told me my job was to smile and wait for the next instruction. So I did. For a long time. And every year I got better at smiling and worse at recognizing myself. Clint studied him. This wasn't a monologue. It wasn't a speech. It was confession stripped of drama. What changed? Clint asked. Dean shrugged slightly. I got tired of being a guest in rooms I was building. Silence again. Then Dean picked up another glass, dried it, and said something that landed with more weight than any boardroom threat. If they don't want you directing, he said, it's because they know what happens when you start seeing the whole picture. Clint stared into his coffee. The question he'd been avoiding rose. What happens? Dean met his eyes. Men stopped being manageable. The word settled between them. Not rebellious. Not romantic. True. Outside, a truck passed. Somewhere a horn sounded. The world kept moving. Clint set his cup down slowly. I don't have a studio, he said. I don't have backing. I don't even have a project. Dean smiled faintly. Neither did I when I started building something of my own. All I had was a refusal. A refusal isn't much, Clint said. It's everything, Dean replied. It's the first brick. He wiped the counter with a cloth, slow and deliberate. You don't need their rooms. You need a place where people are allowed to think out loud, where mistakes don't cost permission, where stories aren't shaped by fear. Clint leaned back slightly. And you think that place exists? Dean's smile deepened. I think it gets built. Usually behind kitchens, or in warehouses, or anywhere someone finally decides to stop asking what's allowed and start asking what's true. Clint looked around the small restaurant. The chipped edges, the steady customers, the way no one here seemed to be performing importance. What are you building? He asked. Dean hesitated. Just long enough to matter. Something small, he said. For now, a space. A collective. A few people who are tired of borrowing permission. He studied Clint carefully. But it could become something else. Clint felt something unfamiliar stir. Not ambition. Not rebellion. Possibility. The kind that didn't glitter. The kind that asked for work. Where? Clint asked. Dean nodded toward the back. There's an old soundstage outside the city. Condemned on paper. Perfect in reality. Leaks. Cracked walls. No executive has stepped inside it in years. He paused. I've been cleaning it myself. Clint looked at him. Why? He asked. Dean's answer came quietly. Because someday someone is going to walk out of a room that tells him to obey, said. And he's going to need somewhere else to stand. Outside, the sun had shifted. The light through the windows no longer slanted. It filled. Clint rose slowly from the stool. Take me there, he said. Dean smiled. Not like a star, like a builder. And in that small, unremarkable restaurant, with the radio humming and plates clinking and the world unaware, two men stood on the edge of something that would not ask permission to exist. Something that would be built. Something that would change far more than contracts. Asterisk. They reached the edge of the city just as afternoon began thinning into something more uncertain. The buildings lost their polish first, then their height, then their sense of purpose. Billboards gave way to rusted warehouse signs. Coffee shops surrendered to auto yards. The air itself seemed older here, carrying the quiet dust of industries that had once believed they would last forever. Dean drove without a map, turning when instinct told him to, slowing near streets that looked more like questions than destinations. Clint watched from the passenger seat, noticing how the city unstitched itself the farther they went. As if the world were peeling back layers to show what remained when image and commerce withdrew, they stopped in front of a chain-link fence, whose sagging gate bore a warning sign so sun-bleached it was nearly blank. Beyond it stood a long, low structure with windows like darkened eyes and a roofline interrupted by missing tiles and bent metal. Weeds threaded through cracked asphalt. Wind nudged a sheet of loose tin somewhere inside, and it answered with a hollow, metallic knock that echoed like a heartbeat through an empty chest. This is it, Dean said. Clint stepped out of the car and felt the silence immediately. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that waits. The fence creaked as Dean pushed it open. The sound was loud in the stillness, announcing them to a place that had not expected visitors. As they crossed the lot, Clint noticed old production numbers spray-painted on loading doors, half scraped away. The ghosts of logos, the remains of ownership. Evidence that something once lived here and then was abandoned when it stopped being useful. Dean unlocked a door near the side. The key resisted, then gave. The door swung inward, with a groan that carried the weight of years inside. The air was cooler, thicker. Dust hung in soft suspension, turning the afternoon light into pale columns. The smell was wood, oil, and something faintly electrical, as if wires still remembered what it meant to be alive. Their footsteps echoed in a way that made the building feel larger than it was. As if it were amplifying them to remind them of their smallness, the stage itself opened before them, a wide, open floor scarred by old tape marks and splintered edges, rigging hanging like skeletal branches from a ceiling far higher than Clint expected. Curtains lay folded and forgotten along one wall, heavy fabric dulled by time. On another wall, faint outlines showed where sets had once been bolted, where doors had opened to places that no longer existed. This was Stage 12, Dean said softly. Western runs. Low-budget dramas. Experimental stuff they didn't want near the main lots. Clint walked slowly, boots disturbing dust that had not been touched in years. He imagined cameras here, crews, someone's first day, someone's last. He imagined scenes interrupted by laughter, arguments, exhaustion, hope. All of it reduced now to quiet and space. "This doesn't look like a beginning," Clint said. Dean's voice carried from somewhere behind him. "Beginnings never do. They look like leftovers." They explored deeper. Old editing rooms lined a side corridor, doors ajar, reels stacked like forgotten prayers. In one room, a cracked mirror still hung above a makeup table. Clint stopped there. For a moment, he did not see himself. He saw the outlines of faces that had once leaned in close, trying to become someone else. "What happens when they find out you're here?" Clint asked finally. Dean did not answer immediately. He was standing near a back wall, touching something that looked like an old power box. "They already know," he said. "They just don't believe anyone would use it." That answer lingered. They worked without discussing a plan. Dean fetched a broom. Clint rolled up his sleeves. Dust lifted into the light in great soft clouds as they swept. Their movements were unglamorous, unrecorded, the kind of labor studios outsourced and credits forgot. But with every stroke of bristles, the floor reappeared. With every box they dragged aside, the space changed. It stopped looking like an end and started resembling something undecided. Hours passed. The sun lowered, and the light shifted from pale to amber to something deeper, like a held breath. Then the sound came. At first, it was distant, a low engine, not the passing traffic of nearby streets. Something slower, heavier. Clint straightened, listening. Tires crunched on gravel outside the gate. Dean froze. The engine cut. Silence returned, but it had changed. It was no longer empty. It was attentive. Footsteps followed, multiple, unhurried. The kind of footsteps that assumed doors would open. Dean moved toward Clint, voice low. "Stay here." Before Clint could reply, the door at the far end of the stage swung inward. Light spilled across the floor, cutting through dust in a sharp, sudden blade. 3 figures entered. Silhouettes first, then men in jackets. Expressions unreadable. They did not look surprised. One of them smiled slightly. "You move fast." Dean didn't. He stayed where he was, broom still in hand. "We heard this place was getting attention," the man continued, glancing around. "Didn't think it'd be you. This isn't your property," Dean said evenly. The man nodded. "On paper. No, but paper tends to catch up." His eyes slid to Clint. Recognition flickered. Not admiration. Calculation. "Didn't expect you to be here," he said. Clint stepped forward slightly. "Then you shouldn't be." The man chuckled. "That's the problem. You both shouldn't." Another of the men spoke now, voice quieter. "There are conversations happening. People are concerned you're trying to build something." Dean's mouth curved faintly. "People are always concerned when they don't control a room." First man took a few steps in, boots echoing. "This stage is condemned. Unsafe. Insurance nightmare. Anything that happens here happens to you." "That's usually how work happens," Clint replied. The man studied him, then gestured around. "You walk away from a system, and you don't disappear. You come somewhere like this. That's how it always starts. A few speeches, some loyalty. Then someone gets hurt. Someone gets sued. Someone gets blamed. He leaned in slightly. You don't want that. Clint met his gaze. You don't want this. Silence thickened. Finally, the man straightened. We're not here to shut you down. Not yet. We're here to remind you that no one builds anything alone. Not really. At some point, you'll need money, distribution, protection, and when you do, this place will stop being invisible. He gestured to the stage. Until then, consider this your warning. They left as they had come, the door swinging shut behind them. The engine returned. Gravel answered. Then even that was gone. For a long moment, neither Clint nor Dean spoke. You expected that, Clint said. Dean exhaled slowly. I expected interest. Not that quickly. Clint looked around the vast, half-cleaned space. They're not going to ignore this. Dean nodded. No, they'll wait. That's how structures test resolve. They let time do the threatening. Clint walked toward the center of the stage. Stood there. The dust settled around him. What happens when they don't just talk? He asked. Dean's reply came without bravado. Then we find out whether this is an idea or a decision. They returned to cleaning. But the air had changed. Each movement now carried meaning. Each sound felt like a declaration. They weren't preparing a space anymore. They were claiming one. As night deepened, lights flickered on, not fully, not evenly, but enough. The stage glowed in tired yellows and soft shadows. Dean dragged 2 old chairs from a side room. They sat near the center, looking small in the vastness. You ever notice, Dean said quietly, how the biggest places always try to make you feel small, and the smallest ones always dare you to become something? Clint watched the ceiling, the rigging, the quiet. I don't know what this becomes, he said. Dean nodded. Good. That means it's still honest. A sound interrupted them then. Not engines this time. But a knock, lighter, hesitant. They both turned. The door opened slowly, revealing a young man standing in the frame, holding a folder to his chest as if it were armor. I heard someone was using this stage, he said. I didn't think it was true. Dean stood. Who told you? The young man hesitated. No one. People talk. When something starts without permission, it makes noise. He swallowed. I'm a writer, or I was. They shelved everything I touched. Said my stories were inconvenient. Clint looked at Dean. Dean looked at Clint. Then Dean stepped aside slightly. We're cleaning, he said. But you can stand. The young man entered. That was how it began. Not with a press release. Not with contracts. Not with headlines. With a door opening by midnight, there were 4 of them. Then 6. An editor. A lighting tech. A woman who'd built sets for decades and was told she was too slow for modern schedules. Each arrived carrying something that had nowhere else to go. A script. A sketchbook. A box of tools. A refusal no speeches were made. No promises offered. Only spaced at one point, Clint stood back and watched them, strangers talking softly, measuring corners, opening boxes, imagining DAG joined him. They'll come harder, Clint said. Dean nodded. Yes, they'll try to fracture this. Yes, they'll use fear. Dean looked at him. They always do, Clint exhaled. Then why does this feel steady? Dean watched the others, the way light caught their faces, the way their hands moved when no one was watching. Because for the first time, he said, no one here is being managed. Outside, the city slept, unaware that a condemned stage was breathing again. Inside, something fragile and dangerous and alive was taking shape. And somewhere far from this quiet building, men who believed obedience was the foundation of creation were beginning to realize that something had slipped beyond their reach. Asterisk. When the ground started moving, the stage no longer felt abandoned. It felt watched. Not in the obvious way. There were no cameras mounted outside the fence. No cars idling too long at the curb. No men in jackets pretending to make calls. It was subtler than that. The electricity stuttered more often. Tools were sometimes not where they had been left. Once, Clint arrived early and found a door unlocked that he knew he had bolted himself the night before. No sign of theft. No sign of forced entry. Just the quiet message that privacy was an assumption, not a right. Inside, however, the place had begun to transform. Lights now held steady across the main floor. Temporary walls had been raised. A corner had been claimed by a cluster of mismatched desks, where scripts, sketches, and coffee cups accumulated like sediment. The air had changed too. It carried the faint heat of work, the smell of sawdust and ink and fabric, and something almost like belief. People arrived before being asked, stayed after being tired, spoke in the low, intent tones of those who felt time mattered again, but growth did not bring peace. It brought weight. Clint felt it in the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. Not out of respect. Out of quiet measurement. These people had come because of a promise that had not yet taken form. And promises, when they remain unseen too long, begin to strain those who carry them. Dean noticed it too. He saw it in the woman who built sets, but now asked whether she should be keeping an eye on other options. In the editor who joked too often about how long it had been since he'd been paid. In the young writer who sat alone longer, rewriting the same page as if the act itself might summon certainty. One evening, as the lights hummed above them and the rest of the crew filtered out, Dean and Clint sat on the edge of the main stage, feet resting on the floor below. "They're not afraid of failure," Clint said quietly. "They're afraid of silence." Dean nodded. Silence after effort is the loudest sound there is. He stared across the space. "We haven't given them anything solid to stand on yet. We've given them room," Clint said. Dean's voice carried a faint edge. Room isn't protection. They both knew what he meant. The first real fracture came 2 days later. It was late afternoon when the power cut, not a flicker. Not a brief dip. A full, sudden absence. The lights went out mid-sentence, plunging the stage into a hush so immediate it seemed to swallow sound itself. Somewhere, something clattered to the floor. Someone laughed nervously. Then quiet settled in, thick, expectant. Dean moved first, reaching for a flashlight he kept in a side room. Clint followed the wall toward the breaker panel. The door to the power box stood open. Inside, wires hung loose. Not snapped. Not burned, removed. Clint stood there for a long moment. The beam of light steady on the exposed lines. "This wasn't the grid," he said. Dean exhaled slowly behind him. "No." They gathered the others and explained calmly, but calm could not disguise meaning. Someone had entered. Someone had not wanted to take. Someone had wanted to interrupt. The crew worked by portable lights that evening. It was quieter than usual. Voices dropped. Movements grew careful, as if the air itself might carry what they said to places they could not see. When most had gone, a man Clint barely knew lingered near the doorway. A grip. Strong hands. Always early. "People are talking," he said finally. Dean leaned against a table. "They always are." The man hesitated. "Not here. Out there. They're saying this place is being discouraged." Clint studied him. And that anyone attached to it is being marked as difficult. Dean waited. The man swallowed. "I've got kids." Silence. Dean nodded once. "Then you should go where you can be steady." The man's eyes flickered. "You're not angry?" Dean shook his head. "No. I'd be lying if I said I didn't understand." The man left. His boots echoed longer than necessary. The next week thinned him. Here, lighting tech, accepted an offer elsewhere. A production assistant stopped showing up. No confrontations. No ultimatums. Only drift. The kind that happens when pressure doesn't announce itself but slowly convinces. Clint watched it unfold and felt something unfamiliar arise, not doubt in the idea, but doubt in his right to ask others to endure its cost. Late one night, long after Dean had gone, Clint stood alone at the center of the stage. The space that once felt like a beginning now felt like a question again. He imagined it empty. He imagined the others returning their borrowed tools, rolling up cables, saying soft goodbyes that tried not to sound like conclusions. He closed his eyes. What if they're right? He murmured to the dark. He didn't hear Dean enter. They're right about something, Dean said quietly. Clint turned. Dean stood a few paces back. Jacket still on, eyes tired but alert. They're right that this is expensive, Dean continued. Not in money, in nerve. Clint looked away. I walked out of a system because I didn't want to be managed. I didn't think about what it meant to build one. Dean stepped closer. You're not building a system. What am I building then? Dean's voice softened. A consequence, Clint exhaled. People are leaving. Dean nodded. Some will, they're afraid. They should be. Clint finally met his eyes. That doesn't sound like encouragement. Dean shook his head slightly. Encouragement lies. Respect doesn't. He gestured around them. This place is doing exactly what it should. It's separating those who like the idea of freedom from those willing to carry it. Clint's jaw tightened. And what if we end up carrying it alone? Dean was quiet for a moment. Then it will still have been carried, he said. The real blow landed 3 days later. They arrived one morning to find the front. Doors chained shut, not government red tape, not legal notices. Just heavy, deliberate chains looped through the handles and locked. On the gate, someone had tied a single white envelope. Inside it was a typed page. No letterhead. No signature. You're creating liability. Liability creates response. End this quietly, and it ends cleanly. That was all. No threats. No explanation. The crew stood clustered behind Clint and Dean, reading the words again and again, as if repetition might reveal a softer meaning. The young writer spoke first. Voice unsteady. Is this real? Dean touched the paper once, then folded it and put it in his pocket. Yes, another woman asked. What happens if we don't? Dean looked at her. Then the room stops being symbolic. Yes. The chains were cut. The doors opened, but the sound of metal falling echoed through the lot like a decision. From that day, pressure sharpened, suppliers hesitated. Permits stalled. Rumors bloomed in places none of them had been. People they'd never met seemed to know exactly who they were, and then the offer came. It arrived through a man who smiled too easily and knew too much. He toured the stage slowly, nodding at the walls, the lights, the people. He praised the courage, the creativity, the ambition. Then he sat with Dean and Clint and spoke the words everyone else had circled. You don't have to do this alone, he said. There are investors who admire what you're attempting. They don't want to stop it. They want to guide it. Clint didn't speak. Dean didn't either. The man continued. A partnership, funding, protection. This place becomes official, legitimate, safe, Dean finally asked, and controlled. The man smiled gently. Structured. He slid a folder across the table. Consider it, he said. Because what you're doing now, this phase always ends the same way. Either it's absorbed, or it collapses. After he left, the folder remained unopened between them. Clint stared at it. They're giving us an exit. Dean shook his head. They're offering us a disguise. Silence pressed in. The crew watched them from a distance. Pretending not to, Clint felt the weight of every person in that room settle into the space between his hands. What if refusing this costs them everything? He asked. Dean's voice was low. What if accepting it costs them themselves? Clint closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw the meeting room again. The polished table. The certainty. The sentence, actors don't direct. They obey. He opened his eyes. We build, he said. Dean studied him. Even if it breaks, Dean asked. Clint nodded once. Especially then. That night, they gathered everyone. No speeches. No theatrics, just truth. Dean told them about the chains, the offer, the implications. Some listened in silence. Some stared at the floor. Some held their breath. When he finished, no one spoke for a long time. Then the set builder stepped forward, the one who'd talked about other options. I spent 20 years being fast, she said. I'd like to try being honest. The editor followed. I forgot what it felt like to work somewhere that didn't already know how it would end. The young writer said nothing. He simply placed his script on the table, as if laying down something fragile and necessary. Not everyone stayed, but enough did. And when the doors closed that night, fewer footsteps echoed, but they were heavier, somewhere beyond the fence. Conversations were shifting, because a place that had been expected to disappear had instead begun to harden, and those who lived by managing rooms were starting to realize that something they could not schedule, could not flatter, and could not frighten had taken root. Asterisk what could not be owned the morning it finally broke. There were no chains on the doors. There were official notices instead. White papers stapled neatly along the fence. City seals. Technical language. Paragraphs that looked harmless until they were read carefully. Structural inspection required. Electrical. Known compliance. Temporary suspension of activity pending. Review. Temporary was the word that made people nervous. Temporary was what institutions called silence before it learned to stay. Dean arrived first. He stood at the gate a long time without touching it, reading every page, memorizing every phrasing, as if knowing the exact shape of what threatened them might somehow reduce its weight. By the time Clint pulled in, several of the crew had gathered behind him, their faces carrying that quiet, collective fear that arrived when effort met a wall. "They're closing us," someone said. Dean didn't answer immediately. He reached out, tore one notice from the fence, folded it once, and slipped it into his pocket. Then he opened the gate. "They're slowing us," he said. "There's a difference." Inside, inspectors were already moving through the building. Clipboards, cameras, measuring devices. They were polite, efficient, apologetic in tone, but final in posture. They pointed to wiring that would require weeks to replace, structural issues that would demand engineers, paperwork that would take longer than anyone there could afford. Clint walked the stage as they worked, feeling each step land heavier than usual. He listened to the language of delay, the vocabulary of compliance. None of it accused them. None of it threatened. It simply rearranged time until momentum starved. By midday, the verdict was clear. No work could continue. Not rehearsals. Not building. Not meetings. The stage had become a sealed object. People stood in small clusters, speaking softly. Some stared at the floor. Others at the walls, as if the space might respond if looked at long enough. The young writer sat on an overturned crate, script folded in his hands. Not opening it, Dean and Clint stood together near the center. "They didn't come for us," Clint said quietly. "They came for time." Dean nodded. "Time is always cheaper than force." An inspector approached, apologetic. "I'm sorry. You'll be notified when a revaluation can be scheduled." Dean thanked him. When the last of them left, the silence that followed was not the empty kind. It was grieving. The crew gathered instinctively. No one asked what happened next. They all knew the question would have to come from the only two who could answer it. Dean looked at them. He saw exhaustion, uncertainty, pride that didn't yet know where to stand. "I won't tell you to wait," he said. "Waiting is expensive. I won't tell you to believe. Belief without movement becomes bitterness." He paused. "But I will tell you this wasn't for nothing." One of the younger crew members spoke, voice strained. "What are we supposed to do now?" Dean answered honestly. "What you need to." Some nodded. Some exhaled. Some didn't hide the disappointment. One by one. They left not dramatically, not angrily, as people leave things they care about when the future becomes too abstract to hold, when only Dean and Clint remained. The building felt enormous again. Clint broke the quiet. "I didn't think it would hurt like this." Dean looked at the ceiling. "That's how you know it wasn't a rehearsal." They stood there for a long time. Two men inside a place that had briefly remembered how to breathe. Finally, Clint spoke again. "They'll take this from us." Dean shook his head slowly. "They already did." Clint frowned. Dean met his eyes. "And they still couldn't touch what happened here." Clint exhaled. "That doesn't keep people fed," Dean said. "But it teaches them how to choose where they starve." They locked the doors that night with a care that felt ceremonial, then they walked away. The city did not notice. Weeks passed, the calls didn't stop. But they changed fewer warnings. More offers, smaller, quieter, invitations that avoided names and used language like private opportunity and mutual alignment. Dean declined them all. Clint didn't return most. They didn't meet as often. Not out of fracture. Out of processing. Clint spent long days alone, walking, reading, watching people who were not being filmed. He began to notice something he hadn't before. How often individuals tried to fit their voices into spaces that were already finished, rather than shaping spaces to hold their voices. Dean, meanwhile, did something unexpected. He started visiting the people who had come, not to recruit, to listen. He sat in small editing rooms, in borrowed offices, at kitchen tables. He heard what they were working on, what they had abandoned, what they now knew they could no longer pretend they didn't want. No cameras, no promises, just conversation. One evening, months after the stage had gone dark, Clint received a message from Dean with only an address. It wasn't a studio. It wasn't even a warehouse. It was an old community hall at the edge of a neighborhood no one ever filmed because it didn't look like struggle or success. It looked like life inside. Folding chairs were arranged in a loose half circle. A few lamps glowed warmly. No stage. No separation. People were there. Some he recognized. Some he'd stood near the front. Not elevated. Not framed. "You're late," Dean said softly. Clint looked around. "What is this?" Dean's mouth curved. "This is what we couldn't build there." Clint waited. Dean gestured gently. "Sit." As Clint took a chair, the room quieted without being asked. Dean spoke not like a leader, but like a host. "We tried to build a place," he said. "A place always attracts power. Power always invites control. So we lost the place. Let the word settle. But what came were not walls. It was a way of working." He looked around. "Nothing here is owned. Nothing here is centralized. No one is above anyone else. There are rooms. There are projects. There are collaborations. If something ends, it doesn't take the rest with it." Clint felt something shift in his chest. Dean continued. "No one can shut this down. Because it doesn't live anywhere." He nodded toward the people. "It lives here." The young writer stood, hesitant. "We've been meeting in groups, sharing, producing pieces independently, helping each other. There's no stage. But there are a dozen small ones," another added, "and no one can close all of them." A woman spoke next. "The stage taught us we didn't need permission to begin. Losing it taught us we didn't need one to continue." Silence followed. Not heavy, full. Clint looked at Dean. "You didn't replace it." Dean shook his head. "I let it spread." Clint exhaled slowly, something like relief and something like awe threading together. "What they built," Clint said quietly, "was a system that could be closed. What we built was a culture." The room began to move. Again, conversations. Laughter. Planning that didn't need a schedule. Clint sat back and watched. No cameras. No announcements. No single place to point to and say, "This is it." And he understood then what had truly changed. They had not built a studio. They had dismantled a dependency later, as people filtered out into the night. Clint and Dean stood near the door. "They were right about one thing," Clint said. Dean waited. "Actors don't direct," Clint continued. "Not the way they meant." Dean smiled faintly. "What did they mean?" he asked. "They meant control." Clint looked out at the street, at the quiet movement of people returning to lives no one profited from, but directing. Said isn't control. It's orientation. It's deciding where you stand when the room disappears. Dean nodded once. "And where do you stand now?" He asked. Clint thought of the meeting table. The gate, the stage, the notices, the chairs, the people. "Wherever the work can breathe," he said. Dean's smile deepened, not for an audience, for a friend. And somewhere, Far from headlines and contracts and gates that rose and fell, something irreversible had taken place. A kind power had been removed from the hands that named it and placed back into the hands that lived it.